for joining us for the latest installment of our energy webinar series. And today we're very delighted to be able to speak about Chile and talk about some of the changes in the last couple months in terms of the policy vision and the policy outlook for the energy sector in Chile. And as a matter of fact, there's an entire new vision that the Piñera government that came into office just recently has crafted called La Ruta Energética. And we're very happy to have somebody from the Ministry of Energy in Chile, Javier Bustos, who is the division head for energy policy and outlook at Chile's Ministry of Energy, who's joining us today and will share with us this webinar presentation on Chile's energy policy roadmap. Javier, thanks so much for joining us and presenting this afternoon.
Thank you very much for the invitation and the opportunity to present the energy roadmap.
Excellent. And so in terms of a brief background, but first let me take care of a quick logistical, a couple logistical issues. For those of you who have joined us before, you know the rough structure, the outline for our webinar series, and the agenda that we tend to follow is some brief welcoming remarks by yours truly, followed by the principal presentation, in this case by Javier Bustos from Chile. That's about 30 minutes, 40 minutes or so, and then we'll have a session at the end for your questions and comments and online question and answer session. So for those of you who know about this, bear with me, but we use the chat function for the question and answer portion of the webinar presentation. So if you look right there, depending on your screen, either in the lower bottom left or lower bottom center, there's the chat function. I just wrote the word question. You have a chat bar there. Just simply write your question or comment and hit return, and it'll appear on the screen there. And we can get to those once Javier has had the opportunity to present his entire presentation and share his principal remarks. Feel free to post any point along the way. You don't have to wait till the end of his presentation. We'll be able to have those there and come back to them. So if there's something that comes up during the course of his presentation you want to ask specifically about, don't feel like you need to wait and come back to it. Go ahead and post that question or comment right there in the chat function, and we'll be able to get to it. So that's the rough agenda. That's the outline for the discussion today. And I'm very excited because Chile, for many years, has been a country that all of us focused on Latin America have been very interested in understanding in terms of the energy policy arena. And obviously, there's been a huge amount of debate and discussion in Chile over the years about what their energy mix should be. And that's been an amazing debate to witness, from the role of hydro, the role of natural gas, the role of LNG imports, the role of gas pipelines, at one point in time, the evaluation of nuclear energy. But more recently, the leadership and the move to further deployment of renewable energy, and I think that's something that across administrations in Chile we have seen. And so I think that's what's very interesting to hear from Javier today, is just in fact how there's a bit of a seamless transition when it comes to political change in Chile on the energy policy front. And I think that's exactly what the Ruta Energética is intended to do, is to continue this consensus, or this general consensus in Chile across many sectors of the economy and government, industry, and citizens as to what exactly the energy policy vision is and how to get there. And that's increasingly more a renewable energy policy, or renewables playing an increasing proportion of the energy mix in Chile. So with us today is Javier Bustos, who will indeed explain all of these things that I poorly outlined here at the beginning. Javier is an economist by training. He's somebody who's spent an extensive amount of time working on energy outlooks and analyzing energy issues. And in the last 3 years, he's worked at Chile's Ministry of Energy, and more recently has spent all of his time working indeed on this energy policy roadmap, or what is called the Ruta Energética in Chile. So without any further ado, I'd like to invite Javier to deliver his presentation, and then I will come back and moderate the question and answer session. And we look forward to your participation. Thank you all so much for joining us today. And Javier, please, over to you for the principal presentation.
Great. Thank you very much, Jeremy. And thank you, of course, the Institute of the Americas for the opportunity to present what have been working here in Chile regarding energy policy and what we expect for the following years. Well, if I have to start with this presentation, perhaps it is useful to show you how has been the development of the energy sector in Chile in the past. And in in particular, when we have the history of the energy policy in Chile, that one has been determined by electricity generation, basically. That is important because in Chile um, we don't have major resources on fossil fuels. And that's the reason why if you see the evolution of the energy policy in Chile, that one it is linked to the, the power generation, the electricity generation. If we use this figure from the International Energy Agency, what we have is that hydropower has been very important in the past. It is still important, but fossil fuels start to be relevant in the 90s. That's why energy security was so important because of the fluctuation in hydropower, and security was perhaps the first stepstone of the energy policy in Chile. But of course, with the natural gas crisis around 2006, 2005, what we have was a change in our energy matrix, replacing natural gas with what we have at that moment available. In the short term, it was oil, but in the following years, we replace it with coal. And that's how our situation right now is that almost 40% of our electricity generation comes from coal, and 30% from hydropower, and the third source is not gas, but it comes from LNG. But recently, what is interesting is that solar and wind started to grow very quickly in the last few years. Well, all the main principles of our energy policy evolve with these changes in the resources. What we have perhaps 10 years ago was that we were depending a lot on the natural gas from Argentina, and that's the reason why we started to develop an own energy policy with principles based on security, efficiency, and also in a sector like in Chile where we don't have public companies in the production of energy. All the sector is private. The only public company in Chile is the petroleum company ENAP. And with that in mind, what we have was an evolution of the energy policy that there was a consensus we needed to do something around 2011, 2012. It was important to interconnect our electricity system. It was important to foster the deployment of renewables, and it was important to move forward in several important features of the energy sector that weren't updated since the 80s. Um, and that's the reason why in the last 5 years we have a new energy policy that a long-term view. This was Energy 2050. Energy 2050 is our energy policy for the next 30 years. But when you have an energy policy for the long run, you have to discuss also what you are going to do in the next in the short term, in the next years. And that's the reason why it was important to have an energy agenda. And the new agenda that we have in this administration of President Sebastián Piñera, a roadmap. So to complement all this evolution, we have right now the energy roadmap 2018-2022 for the next 4 years. For the long run, we still are aligned to the energy policy 2050, and that's important because that long-term energy policy was prepared in a very participatory process that took over one year and a half. And it is important that the change in the administration from President Bachelet to President Piñera didn't change the long-term energy policy. What we are going to do in this administration is to update that energy because it was designed that every 5 years we have to update that long-term energy policy. So that's the main framework on the long term. But in the short term, what we have? Well, what we have is the Ruta Energética that also was prepared in a participatory process. In Chile, we have right now 16 regions. We have workshops in 15 of these 16 regions, just because the last region was created last year, and we still don't have a local administration, so we can with them at the moment we were preparing the Ruta Energética. But in March we started participatory process where we have over 2,000 people in all these workshops collecting ideas, proposals for what we have to do in these 4 years in terms of energy policy. This is the way we wanted to start because we think that we have, of course, a program for a governmental program for these 4 years, but it has to be complemented with the views of the citizenship. That has been a characteristic of our energy policy for the last few years, and we want to keep it. A lot of the problems that we have in the past in our energy policy was because they weren't participative enough. And as you can see in this graph here that the 15 regions have workshop with more than 200, in some occasions almost 300 people that were devoting one morning to discuss all the issues they were worried about energy. And we invited people that came from civil society, that came from the public sector, of course, local private and local public sector, and also from academic institutions all along the country. The academic background, it is important for the discussion, particularly when we are trying to modernize the electricity and the energy sector. The roadmap was prepared between March and April, and that's the way that was presented to the to President Piñera on May 25th. And we didn't print many copies of it, but you can download them with this QR code. The idea is to have this Ruta Energética, this roadmap, as the agenda we will have for the next 4 years. So if we start with the content of the Ruta Energética, what we have is we have 7 pillars. The main goal of the roadmap is energy sustainability. And the pillars that we have start with energy modernization. Of the main characteristics of Ruta Energética is that we are trying to modernize the energy sector. I'm going to go in detail in each pillar next to this slide. In the second pillar, and another main characteristic of the Ruta Energética is that our social SIL. We want to increase our access to energy, to the quality of this access, and there are a lot of issues here that we have to devote time and effort. The third pillar is energy development. The fourth is energy with low emissions, and here, of course, one of the main characteristics is renewables. But we, for the first time, start looking at in the fifth pillar, a lot of attention to efficiency in transportation. Here, electromobility is something that we are looking to accelerate the process to the deployment of electromobility in Chile. The sixth pillar is energy efficiency. That has been a strong topic in our energy policy in the past year, and now there is a continuation of it. And finally, for the first time, we have a pillar that is related to all the others, and is energy education and training. It is interesting that all along the workshops in the country, people were very interested on energy education, on the development of human capital, but to know more about energy, to make better decisions as a consumers, but also to how they can participate as prosumers or producers of energy. This, perhaps in my experience in the ministry, is the first time that this topic appears in every single workshop as one of the most important ones. Starting with the first pillar on energy modernization, we have several actions, and here there is a short list of it. But if we want to start the modernization of our energy sector, bringing the future closer to our citizens, we need to modernize our institutional structure, how we as a government deploy our energy policy actions. And we are going to start modernizing what is the Superintendency of Electricity and Fuels, and also our National Commission of Nuclear Energy. It was mentioned by Jeremy that in the past we were looking perhaps as an alternative for the long-term development of the energy sector, the nuclear option. Right now, the National Commission of Nuclear Energy is providing services on health, on agricultural, on mining, on the production on energy. We don't have right now an agenda, and what the National Commission of Nuclear Energy is doing is researching of how it is possible to have a nuclear plant in Chile, but the political decision about it is going to be made in the actualization, the update of the National Energy Policy 2050. It's not a decision that we're going to take right now. We want to have all the evidence and all the research that it is possible to see if it is an alternative or not. Coming along with this modernization of our institutional setting, we are going to devote our time to a new legislation on distribution of electricity. We have updated in the past, a couple of years ago, the transmission regulation. We have updated a few years ago the regulation on generation, but right now we need to update the electricity distribution regulation because it is a regulation that was very effective when it was designed in the 80s, but right now it is not the best regulation if we want to include new businesses, the role of prosumer, distributed generation, all these features of the energy modernization that we want to incorporate in our sector. Other issues are related to middle-sized and isolated electrical system. We have a particular geography in Chile with a lot of islands, and we need to have a better regulation on those electrical systems. But when we talk about modernization, of course, we talk about innovation too. And one of the issues is going to be to have a coordination committee, a public-private coordination committee for innovation in energy. Many actors, private and public, are devoting right now time for innovation and entrepreneurship in the energy, and we think we want to coordinate them in a better way. And of course, as I mentioned before, we in these 4 years are going to update the National Energy Policy 2050, and we want to implement also a participatory process as it was included in 2015. On the second pillar, when we want to discuss energy with a social SIL, what we are saying is that this is the heart of our work, of our task. We want to create for the first time a map of energy vulnerability in the country. It has a particular situation because 99% of our population has access to electricity. In rural terms, it's above 93%. So what we have left is perhaps the more expensive, the more difficult part of the population to reach and bring them access. But the access is only one part of the problem. We have problem of the quality of this access to electricity. But what happened to the access to hot water? That's another issue, and that's part of this map of energy vulnerability that we want to prepare, so we can connect and improve the energy access for vulnerable families in Chile. Also, related to this issue of access and vulnerability is the possibility that the local communities can associate with energy projects. So there can be a more decentralized way to produce energy, in particular electricity. And these associativity mechanisms are particularly useful with the indigenous communities. Also, if we talk about energy with a social SIL, we need to discuss how the women are participating in the energy sector. In the last 2 years, we have been devoting time to this discussion. This is a new discussion, perhaps, for many countries. For us, and for this sector in particular, it is new. So we have conformed a public and private roundtable to discuss how we can foster the inclusion of women in the energy sector, not only in terms of jobs, but also in terms of education, in terms of prepare better for consumer decisions in terms of energy, because in households, women are also the ones who take the decisions of the majority of the energy consumption in the house. And also a topic that is related with energy and the social problems that we can have is that sometimes when we prepare our electricity regulation, we devote a lot of time to design incentive mechanism for private firms, and we usually think that the regulator has all the information possible and has all the power to monitor these regulated sectors, and also the regulator is the one that is better prepared to represent the consumer interest. And this assumption has to be questioned, and we need to discuss how we can have active representation of the consumer interest in the regulatory process. That is something that has appeared with a lot of um, strength in the discussion, in the regulatory discussion in Chile, in particular in the transmission regulation, where large clients have to pay for a part of the transmission services. Pillar, if we have the first one talk about modernization, the second one talk more about the social issues. In the third one, we want to devote time for a better and more sustainable infrastructure for the energy deployment. We want here to have an investment in the energy sector that is sustainable. So what we want to have is to have the better projects to be developed in Chile, and that's why we have a plus energy plan, Más Energía. This plus energy plan wants to reduce the red tape for the projects, but of course for the good projects, and for these projects to reduce their time in the processing for authorizations in a 20%. In that way, to come back to the levels that we used to have 5 years ago about the time it took to get the approval for a particular project. In terms of infrastructure, and this topic, it is very important for the national government, not only to reduce red tape, but also to progress in electrical interconnection with Peru and with Argentina. Um, we are right now studying not only the interconnection with Peru, but we are studying 4 different interconnections with Argentina. In terms, this is on electricity, but also we are discussing right now um, the comeback of natural gas from Argentina to Chile. The energy ministry from Argentina is going to visit Chile today and tomorrow, and we are right now discussing if it is going to be possible to have exports of natural gas from Argentina to Chile back this summer. In terms of also of infrastructure, what we are working in the ministry is with regional energy plans. We have 16 regions. Well, what we are working in these regional energy plans is to have all the information about energy, all the maps of the potential of each region characterized with a sustainable dimension. So when we discuss any kind of um, territorial management, we are prepared with all the information about the potentials of each region. And this information is very useful not only for the public policy, but also for private investment.
Javier? Seems like we're having a bit of a technical issue. 1 second, please. Uh, Javier, are you still there?
Hello?
Hello? Yes, we hear you. Okay, please. Sorry, we lost you for a slight moment there, Javier. Please continue. Sorry about that, everyone.
Sorry, perhaps my connection here in the office had an interruption. We were discussing this interruption in electricity, and we have this interruption in the communication. But well, that that's why it is important to have a very good idea of where the customers, the consumers who have special conditions, who are dependent on electricity for their lives, that we need to identify them and provide solutions in case of a shortage, in case of a blackout. In the next pillar, the energy with low emissions that we mentioned, of course, is related with renewables. We have a lot of potential, and we have been increasing the amount of full generation in um, in our energy matrix. Uh, right now, we are reaching fast the 20% of our generation matrix with non-conventional renewables. So if we add up that to hydropower, we can reach 50% very, very soon. Our goal to 2050 was 70% of renewables in 2015. We think we can reach a higher level, and of course, in the discussion of our 2050 goals next year, in the update of the energy policy, of course, we are going to be discussing about a level of renewables much higher than 70%. But not only we want to promote renewable solutions at a centralized level, but also at a distributed level. And that's why we have a particular goal to increase the capacity of renewables in distributed generation. Also, for the first time, we are including actions in terms of thermal use of renewables, in particular with biogas, with cogeneration, even with geothermal energy. We have the first geothermal plant in South America that started operation last year, and we expect to increase the amount of geothermal plants in the future. With energy with low emissions, we have here also the actions for the decarbonization of the energy matrix. This year there was an agreement between the four major companies that have coal plants they agreed not to build any new coal plant in Chile. The last coal plant will start operation this year, and that's going to be the last one. And we are right now in a roundtable, public and private sector and NGOs also participating in a discussion on which could be the best schedule to retire the current coal plants. There is no date for that. We are not saying that all the coal plants will have to be retired by 2030. No, we don't have a date. But what we are working with the companies that they will present to the energy ministry a schedule for the next years, the next decades, on when they're going to retire these coal plants. That schedule is going to be ready by 2019, by perhaps July 2019. And we are discussing many issues that the decarbonization has, not only the environmental ones, not only the effect on health, but also important for us is the effect on energy security, on energy prices, and also on the economic side of it. There are local communities that depend on the jobs of these thermoelectric plants. So all these features are going to be discussed in the following months, and we expect to have a plan next year. Also, in terms of emissions, we need to reduce local emissions, and basically in Chile what we have is a problem with the use of biofuels, the use of firewood, and we have promised a regulation on solid biofuels so we can have a better use of firewood and reduce local emissions. In terms of global emissions, Chile has a green tax, a small green tax of $5 per ton of global emissions of CO2, but we want to explore other alternatives that are complementary to it, like an emission trading system, and we have started this private work on the side of mitigation. On the side of adaptation to climate change, we are starting a discussion of a climate change legislation for Chile, and the adaptation and mitigations are going to be two of the main topics to include in that new piece of legislation. On transportation, here we want to increase the number of electric vehicles in the country. We have only a couple of hundred of electric vehicles. We think there is a lot of potential in Chile for this transportation, particularly on the public transportation. But electric vehicles is not the only alternative to have a better efficient transportation. And that's why we are going to include in our proposal for legislation in energy efficiency to have standards for transportation. Also, to have more information to the public, and that's why we want to include a web platform that can increase the knowledge of these technologies of like electromobility to all the population. There are a lot of barriers in terms of information that can be reduced with a better education, more information on how the consumers can adopt these new technologies. But when we discuss efficient transportation, not all is electric vehicles. We think that there is an opportunity also for hydrogen in the future, perhaps natural gas in the short term. We are open to any technology that has low emissions, and we are technology neutral in these terms. If we move to the next pillar, what we're going to have is our actions on energy efficiency. And of course, here the first and most important is going to be to have a new legislation of energy efficiency. This has been a promise for many years. It was a promise of the previous administration, but it was not possible to include one. And we think that right now is the moment to have a legislation in Chile. Chile is one of the few countries that doesn't have a regulation of energy efficiency. And we are including actions for large consumers of energy, but also actions for construction, to have a standard in the construction of buildings, also on transportation, as I mentioned before, and finally to have actions on the public sector, because the public sector has to give the example, and it is important to reduce our public budget to be very efficient in terms of our energy expenditures. On energy efficiency, we have many actions complement that are complementary to the new regulation. In terms of infrastructure, we have just about to start a public school program when we're gonna increase the energy efficiency of public schools in Chile. That's gonna be very important because on winter many schools have temperatures of 12 or 13 Celsius degrees Celsius, and of course that's an issue not only in terms of energy poverty in some way, but also in terms of the quality of education that we can have in these kind of conditions. We also want to have the demonstrative projects for district heating. That's going to be a good complement to our regulation of biofuels, solid biofuels, to have district heating, particularly in the south of the country, where the problems of local emissions related to firewood is a major issue. As I mentioned before, the public buildings are going to give the example, and we want to use the ESCO model to have efficient public buildings. And in the private sector, in the local consumers, to increase smart meters. There is an agenda to increase the amount of smart meters we have and reach in the following years 100% of smart meters at the residential level. The final there, as I mentioned before, is energy education and training, and the goal here is to have finally an energy culture in all the population. And when we talk about energy education, there are three major issues. One, of course, is human capital, but we want also to have energy education at school level. And finally, what we have is the information and the education in terms of the citizenships, in terms of having public information available to anyone. In terms of human capital, training and certification of the human capital is going to be a key, and that's why we have a goal in terms of the amount of people we want to train and certify on energy sector. That includes electricity, includes heating, include a lot of technicians and professionals that can work in this sector. Uh, as a footnote, the energy sector in Chile has been the sector who has received more investment in the last 3 years. So there is a lot of employment available for the sector. Mm, This is important not only for the private sector because more technicians and more jobs are being created, but also as a public policy, we want to have a human capital that is prepared in terms of security, in terms of the new technologies, for example, like electromobility, that are going to be deployed very fast in the future. And for school level, we have an energy educational program in terms of energy efficiency, and we want to move this energy educational program to a more integral view, more not only energy efficiency but all the aspects of the energy sector. These 7 pillars have 10 big goals, these mega energy commitments that we have envisioned for these 4 years. And the first one is to create the map of vulnerability that I mentioned before. The second one is to modernize the institutional structure, the superintendent, for example, of electricity and fuels. And the third one is to reduce time of the electricity projects by 25%. The fourth one is to quadruple the installed capacity of decentralized renewable energy. This is an important goal for us. We are right now trying to modify the regulation for net metering, and we think we're gonna be able to fulfill this commitment with a lot of private investment, not only public one. In terms of electric mobility, for us, our goal is to have 10 times more electric vehicles in the country in 2022. This goal will allow us to reach more than 1,000 vehicles, and that's very important if we want to deploy the infrastructure that's going to be important and the regulation for the electric vehicles that is needed. Finally, we want to modernize the the regulation for electricity distribution, regulate biofuels, solid biofuels, regulate energy efficiency, decarbonize the energy matrix, and train 6,000 operators and certify at least half of them in the different aspects of energy. So this is the description of the main goals that we have in our energy roadmap, the more important actions that we have, and I think that's enough information for all the questions you have. The next slide is just our team in the energy ministry, our ministry, and our minister Susana Jimenez, and our vice minister Ricardo Irarrázaval, and all the team that is very motivated to work in all these actions for the next 4 years. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Javier. I guess the most immediate important first question is, where are you in that picture?
Well, I'm not that tall, so I'm the back.
You're too busy in the back working on this. No, look, that was a wonderful presentation, very, very precise, excellent delivery, and an enormous amount of information that underscores just how much Chile is working to develop a really, really, leading edge energy policy outlook. I mean, all the things you were talking about are issues that we've been looking at across the hemisphere in the last couple of years and comprise this global transformation of the energy sector. And you in Chile and your colleagues are clearly working on this. There are a lot of questions, so let me get to them. But first, a really general question as I try and get through and organize some of these questions to deliver to you. But during the campaign, the then candidate, Sebastian Pineda, said that it was his goal, if elected, to reach a renewable target of 100% of the electric sector by 2040. I know during your presentation you talked about the goals that are being analyzed, and you'll set a new goal for next year. But does the rhetoric of the candidate during the campaign translate to probably the new goal going forward?
Well, it is a very good question. Of course, we as a government want to progress as fast as possible to have a more sustainable and renewable electricity matrix. We want to, of course, the president was clear in mentioning that this is a possibility that Chile is prepared and will be prepared in the next decade to have a fully renewable matrix. But also we want to have the opportunity to discuss with all the sectors, with all the participants of the energy policy, like we did last time in 2015, and with all the evidence mentioned, okay, perhaps we can modify our goal that for 2050 and perhaps be more ambitious. But of course, the mandate of the president is to try to reach the goal of a fully renewable matrix as soon as possible, with taking into consideration, of course, the effects on security, the effects on prices, the effects on environment, to make a goal that could be completely sustainable.
Thank you. And let me go right to a couple of questions that link back to that, because to be able to get to that 100% renewable goal, obviously you're going to have to pull out the 40% of the coal in the current mix. There's a couple of questions. One of them is where does the coal come from that Chile uses to generate electricity? And the other question was if you could offer a little bit more detail about the retirement. Particularly the question was wondering if some of these plants have only recently come online, understanding sort of the amortization period, how we manage that. And I know you said that some of that's imprecise, but anything addition you could talk about in terms of retirement of coal facilities would be great.
Okay, about 85 to 90% of the coal that is used in Chile, it is imported from the international markets. Only 10 to 15% is produced in Chile. And in terms of the plans of each one of the firms, there is one firm that requests the retirement of 2 units next year. And they are, well, in Chile we have 28 units in total. It's about 5,400 megawatts. And this same company has announced that they are studying if they're going to retire more units in the following years. There are other companies that have announced that they are studying not necessarily to retire completely the unit, but perhaps to convert it to a different technology, or to have it as a backup in case of an emergency. So that's the alternatives that we can have. The agreement between the companies and the government was to not to have new coal plants and start the discussion to have a schedule to retire the existing ones, but retire the existing unless there is a system of carbon capture installing them. So the goal is closely related to reduction of global emissions. So we right now don't have the plan, but we are studying how fast this can be implemented without sacrificing security and without sacrificing an important impact on the economic side. But also considering that Chile has a an environmental norm that was implemented in 2011 and entering full operation a couple of years ago. So local emissions in terms of thermoelectrics are at international levels. So the real task here is how to perform this decarbonized process without having major negative effects.
Of course, anytime you have almost half of your, and I didn't realize the percentage had gotten that large. So of course, transitioning from that percentage. A quick question on the economics. There's a precise question from somebody about whether or not Chile has renewable energy subsidies, non-hydro that is, and if so, when do they expire?
Chile, the renewable energy revolution in some way in Chile in the last couple of years that started with legislation in 2012 on having a goal for non-conventional renewals by 2025 of 20%. That legislation didn't include any subsidy. All One of the good features of the Chilean model is that all the renewable projects have been developed competitively. What we did was to reduce the barriers that these projects had to participate for long-term contracts in auctions for long-term contracts. And when we reduced those barriers, and they could compete with with conventional technologies, what we have seen is that they don't need subsidies. If they get a long-term contract with a competitive price, it is enough to deploy them. So that's the reason why the Chile model does not include any kind of subsidies.
For example, Mexico, and where we're seeing these prices, the competition and competing with in the mix is very, very interesting. Moving on to something that I think is related to this debate over the competitiveness of the market. And you talked about how Chile doesn't really have state-owned enterprise in the energy sector, with the exception of ENAP, which is largely an oil and gas company, mainly in the south of the country. But in the last administration, it began to participate in the power market. And so a question from one of the participants is, will that continue in terms of ENAP's presence in the power generation market in Chile under the Piñera government?
Well, the corporate governance of ENAP changed also in the previous government, and now it's a corporate governance that is more independent from the energy ministry. That is important because if the ENAP take decisions in terms of energy investment, it is important that the energy ministry is not in the directory of it. And that's why that's gonna be a decision in terms of the plan of investment of ENAP. Right now, what the ENAP has mentioned is that they're gonna continue with the investment they have in geothermal. The only plant that we have here in Chile of geothermal energy is a joint venture between Enel and ENAP. But so far they haven't shown any new plans of investment in the electricity sector. What happens is that right now we have a lot of investment in generation, and prices are reducing a lot. So perhaps ENAP has more incentive to invest in other sectors of the energy, in other segments of the energy sector. And particularly, they have mentioned they want to invest more on natural gas exploration, and in the south part of the country, and also some investment they have with our neighbors in Argentina.
And you mentioned Argentina, and I wanted to try and we're running out of time, and we have a lot of questions. So there's two key topics, distributed generation and energy storage, that I want to get to. And if you're okay, Javier, to go a few minutes over, maybe 5 minutes extra, I'd like to do that. But first, let me ask you, because there are some questions about, you talked about the interconnection with Argentina, you talked about the visit of the minister. What about the Vaca Muerta? Is that going to be something that supports further gas supplies and exchanges of gas as well as electricity? And then more to the other side, what about the interconnection with Peru? Where does that stand? And are you and the new administration in Chile engaging with Peru on that interconnection?
Well, with Argentina, of course, we have considered the effect of Vaca Muerta. We are in conversations on having the opportunity of importing natural gas from that basin, particularly in summer when there are excellents in the Argentinian energy sector. But of course, this was announced a couple of months ago with the previous Minister of Energy in Argentina, and right now we are talking with the current minister, and we hope that we could have the first exportation from Argentina starting in October. But of course, it depends on the conversations and the situation that Argentina will have in the following months. In terms of electricity with Argentina, we are progressing very well. We are right now with international funding doing a study, a binational study on these 4 different places where they can interconnect with Argentina. And this is going to be the first time we will have these studies. In the case of Peru, it's different because we have done studies before, and what we are doing right now is updating these studies to and continue the conversations. From our government, we are very open to interconnections. Just as an anecdote, I just mentioned that we have 10 major goals in our roadmap, but the president, in the launch of the roadmap, he told us that we will have an additional one, and the 11th one is going to be the interconnection with our neighbors.
Perfect answer. No, thank you. So the 11th pillar, or the 11th mega goal, I guess is what is it? So distributed generation and storage. Let's take both of those and wrap up the webinar, which I know we could require a lot more time. But if you could quickly share the role of distributed generation in the short and long term, how you view that in the roadmap. I mean, you shared some of the details, but if you could explain and go into a little bit further depth, specifically on the distributed generation. I know you saw huge growth in decentralized energy, quadrupling, I think is what you cited. So any more details you want to share briefly on distributed generation?
Well, right now on distributed generation, we are trying to change the legislation of net metering. Right now in Chile, the net metering legislation applies only to clients below 100 kilowatts, and we want to expand it to 300 kilowatts. This is important to increase the base that can use this regulation to implement distributed solutions. There are other changes also to favor, for example, community generation in a decentralized way. But also, we need to improve not only the regulation, we need to improve also other factors. Perhaps this is something that happens in other countries, but for example, if we want to install roof panels, how good is the quality of our roofs? How good is the electrical installation in our households to have a solar rooftop? Those kind of issues are perhaps the one that are going to be discussing, and we're going to try to reduce the barriers for the deployment of this technology. And also in discussion of the distributed electricity regulation, we are going to include a more global framework for distributed generation and also for batteries or storage.
You just led us directly to the final question. We had a couple of different people posing the question. What is where does it stand in terms of energy policy, not just in the roadmap, but in terms of some of the legislation? And I know you talked about the efforts on distribution legislation and a new law for distribution. What can you tell us that the Chilean government and legislators are working on with regards to the question of energy storage?
Well, we are right now discussing how, for example, storage can be included in the expansion of our transmission system. This is important because not only in Chile, but in many places in the world, there is a discussion if storage could be part of a transmission infrastructure, perhaps in some settings. But also, we have very large projects of hydro pump that could be storage from the generation side. And we need to be clear how is going to be the regulation for storage at the distributed level. Right now, as I mentioned, our regulation in the distributed sector comes from the 80s. It was a very visionary regulation at that time. It was even before the regulation in the United Kingdom. But right now, it's a regulation that has no role for the distributed services, the new kind of energy services that can be deployed in a infrastructure of networks, of smarter networks that can be deployed in the future. So that's going to be a major part of our discussion in distributed regulation, and we are sure that we need flexibility for the deployment of variable renewables that we want to have in the future, and storage is going to be a central part of that flexibility.
Excellent. And I think we have just about exceeded all the time we have. Javier, thank you so much. We will certainly, I think the main point here is to be continued. This is a very important effort in a roadmap. There's a lot of items that you guys are setting in terms of clear objectives. It's a very well organized roadmap, but let's be honest, there is a lot of work to be done. So we'll look forward to getting an update from you and your colleagues at the Ministry of Energy in Chile again shortly, and hopefully we can do so either online or even better at one of the Institute of the Americas roundtables in the coming months. And so we look forward to continue our engagement with the Ministry of Energy and the government of Chile. Congratulations. I know you all have been working very hard, as you said, over 2,000 participants in the community workshops. Congratulations on what is a very, very clear and well-detailed roadmap in the Ruta Energética. So thank you, Javier. We look forward to keeping in touch. And just a quick note on some additional Institute of the Americas programming. We'll have another webinar in just over a week on CFE and actually some similar discussions of the power market, but this time in Mexico with CFE's transformation and the updates in the Mexican electric market. And then we'll have a couple of in-country roundtables coming in September and October. So stay tuned. Please continue to engage with us. Thanks, Jacqueline Sanchez, for your help. Follow us on social media. There it is up on the screen. Thank you again, Javier. Have a wonderful morning, afternoon, whatever the case may be where you are. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. It was a great idea, and we hope to exchange how the roadmap will be implemented in the future. So thank you very much again.
Thank you. Say hello to all our friends and colleagues at the ministry, Carissa and everyone there. So thank you. And Pauline, of course.